2017 and 2018, I was lucky to be the head of sports science for the Irish rugby football team, or football union, looking after the national 15s program as the national sports scientist. So looking after sports science provision for the provinces and kind of some national standards, while also fulfilling a day-to-day role at the sevens. And I've been lucky to be the author of 60 peer-reviewed research papers, as well as work with a number of teams that are highlighted below in a consultancy capacity. So I suppose just to put into context before we get started, like when we look at how we go about monitoring training load and how we go about interacting with our athletes, it's with the goal of being successful at the end of any season. And in Gaelic football, there's two main trophies, and for different teams, success is defined differently. So it might be finishing as high in the league table as possible. It might be qualifying for Europe. It might be winning the league. But with the sound application of sports science and the sound application of respecting context and monitoring your athletes, we can get our captains to lift the trophy or any trophy that's available at the end of a season. And that's our goal as practitioners, is to employ a system that improves their physical, their physiological, their technical, their tactical abilities in order for them to be the most successful team or the most successful player they can be, which hopefully leads to success for us as a team as a byproduct of the sound application of sports science principles. When we look at this from a Gaelic football perspective, I think it's important that I introduce what the sport is first. So Gaelic football is the national sport of Ireland. It takes place on a pitch that's about 40% larger than a soccer field. And it's probably a mix between rugby and AFL with elements of hand passing and kick passing. Two teams of 15 players compete across a 70-minute period, with stoppages added at the discretion of the referee. Players can move the ball with hand and foot, and there's a lot of contacts and accelerations and decelerations during match play. Typically, players complete between 7 and 11 kilometers during match play, with anywhere between 800 and 1800 meters of high-speed running, which is defined as any meters covered over 5.5 meters per second. And they'll typically complete anywhere between 80 and maybe 130 accelerations during match play. The interesting thing here, and why monitoring is so important, is these are actually amateur athletes. So they have day-to-day jobs, but they train with a professional training ethos. So for example, there could be 2 or 3 gym sessions in a week in conjunction with 3 or 4 pitch sessions and a match session at the end, on a Saturday or Sunday. Typically, our training sessions are in the evening, typically anywhere between 7 and 9 p.m. and last anywhere between 60 and 90 minutes in duration. So I suppose if you still don't understand what Gaelic football is and you're wondering what am I talking about, here's an example of a 2-minute clip from YouTube of the All-Ireland semi-final in 2019 between two of the best teams over the last decade who've contested many All-Ireland finals. So this is an example of match play in Gaelic football context. Please remember these are amateur athletes and this takes place in an 82,000 seater stadium. Okay, so there we see the execution of the skills that are required to play Gaelic football. Kicking the ball over the bar scores you 1 point, and kicking the ball into the net scores you 3 points. Typically during match play, about 80% of our players will hit above 90% of their max speed. So again, it's a very quick, intermittent sport that relies on both aerobic and anaerobic energy systems. Before we look at monitoring training load, though, I think it's important to redefine where sports science fits within the general training process. And while it's at the center of this Venn diagram, that's not to say it's the most important thing here, but I think sports scientists and even strength and conditioning coaches, if they're doing both a sports science and a strength and conditioning role, have been kind of labeled as the GPS analyst, or the guy or girl who produces data and feeds it back to a coach. But a sports scientist and a good strength and conditioning practitioner should sit at the center of any process because they can communicate with multiple stakeholders. So for example, in my context, I provide match reports and training reports, not only to the players and the coaching staff, but also to our nutritionist. So they can interact with players in terms of improving recovery strategies or improving carbohydrate loading, improving recovery, fueling, and sleep. Additionally, from a performance science perspective, we can start to link with our performance analysts and see where those technical and tactical elements of play interlink with the running data that we're getting off GPS. Additionally, with our coaches, we interlink with them to improve their training drills with respect to training construction. Can those drills best replicate the worst case scenario or the maximal work rate that a player will have during match play? Can it replicate the demands of match play? Can we pick out different player numbers or different pitch dimensions or different small-sided games that work best at either over or underloading our athletes when required? Additionally, then the sports scientist, if you're lucky to have one, should be able to interlink and chat to the strength and conditioning coach about where the data sits, respecting context, providing the rationale for any intervention that's going to be run, to say that, yes, what we're doing here is supported by peer review literature, but also taking that literature and understanding how it fits in our own context. Additionally, sports scientists and physios and even strength and conditioning coaches should have a really strong working relationship so that we can rehab players appropriately. And we need to respect that everyone has the right to their own say, and everyone should communicate freely within a strong working backroom team. And this is typically what it's like, is we see probably two silos at play of the practitioner who is the fast operator, who's really concerned about the here and now. Typically, our coaches will operate off how they feel the team is moving or what they think needs to be improved based on match play previously. They have the direct impact. So if we don't have good communication with them and we don't provide, as sports scientists or strength and conditioning coaches, the evidence base to their daily activities, we're going to have a very indirect impact on the training process or improving our athletes' physical and physiological abilities so they don't get injured. Typically, the practitioner will see the researcher as kind of a bit of a weirdo who's really data focused, a bit slow in nature in terms of they take time to feed back their data and they take time when feeding back a narrative around the data. But that's because scientists and researchers are concerned about validity and reliability and sensitivity of numbers. They want to make sure that the numbers they're providing and the numbers they're commenting on are robust and reliable and they're sensitive to change. A good sports scientist will provide the evidence for all systems within a program, whether that's monitoring, testing, any running conditioning that will take place, and any small-sided games that will take place. They're typically a little bit more statistical in nature, and they can become probably too driven by data at some points, and we need to probably be more guided or informed by the data that we have. If we don't have strong communication between the practitioner and the researcher, then the researcher who reads all the literature and looks to provide an evidence to what we're doing will have a very indirect impact and typically probably will have no effect on the program. And the practitioner will keep plowing ahead with their intuition and their gut feeling, which might actually place our athletes at more risk of injury. So we need to make sure that there's strong communication between the practitioner, who would be our physio and our S&C coach and our management, and also the sports scientist or researcher that's within place within any club environment. And the reason we want this is because everyone on this call wants to build a dominant football player, whether that be a dominant football player in your club or at national level, or whether that be a dominant Gaelic football player in my context. The thing we need to understand is the reasons we need to respect context is if we look at these 6 pillars of performance, as a strength and conditioning coach or as a physio or as even a sports scientist, we only have a direct impact on probably 3 of the 6 things, being physical, physiological abilities, and also that recovery knowledge. And it's probably recovery that probably gets missed out because we get too focused on monitoring GPS data and monitoring pre-training screens and post-training wellness. If we focus on appropriate planning, appropriate focus on recovery, appropriate nutrition with our athletes, and also respect those conversations that we need to have with them, then we will build a dominant player that will stay injury free. And we know that teams that suffer less injuries typically finish higher up any league table than any other teams. If you look at technical abilities, tactical knowledge, and mindset, we probably have a small percentage impact on that, if any at all. If we're lucky enough to be involved with our coaches in terms of manipulating small-sided games or suggesting drill content for training, then we can say we have a little bit of an impact on those other 3 pillars of performance. The aim of monitoring training load is to build a dominant player from a physical, physiological, and robustness perspective. And the reason we want to build a robust player is because every time we step on the pitch, we're walking a tightrope. And I call this the training performance tightrope, where us as practitioners, we want to improve and get positive performance adaptations every time we step on the pitch. But every time a player steps on a pitch, there is a risk that he or she might get injured. And they always walk this tightrope between improving performance and suffering maladaptation or falling off the rope and getting injured. Everything in white and with bullet points, though, needs to be respected in order to walk this performance training tightrope effectively. And if we look at the multitude of variables we need to understand, we now begin to understand that we need to really respect context. So, for example, before any training takes place, we should understand our athletes' capacity. What's their running capacity? What's their previous training history looking like? What are their strength levels relative to their body weight? What type of power can they produce in movements such as counter movement jump or any force dex data? What is their previous injury history and what's their technical ability? We need to also understand the sport. What are the typical movements? Most importantly, what's the typical injury profile of the sport? Do we have interventions to mitigate against that injury profile? What are the typical match play demands? What are the typical training demands? What does a training week look like? And what are ultimately the physical needs that the coaching staff require of players that play within your team? What are the physiological, physical, and technical needs? For us, then, we need to plan and monitor appropriately. How much meters or how long do we need to spend on the pitch? What's the appropriate dose that we need to put into our players to improve their fitness levels and improve their technical and tactical ability? How do our athletes respond to that? Whether that be an internal response or a post-training response through changes in wellness? And are we managing this fitness and fatigue ratio appropriately with our athletes? And this all links back to having the appropriate stimulus. If we have an appropriate stimulus, typically we have a planned load and an actual load. Does that load meet or exceed match play demands or match play requirements? Or are we targeting a specific physical or physiological quality within the specific training session we're about to complete? Finally, then, from a contextual perspective, if we're training, we need to understand what are the most important players within our squad? Who are the players that are going to lead us to be successful this year? And if they're flagging for wellness or anything, do they need to be maybe modified with respect to training minutes rather than taking them out of the training altogether? Are we respecting a player's performance bandwidth? So we know that we can only peak for a certain period of the year, and that respects that performance bandwidth. Are we always looking and seeking to find that minimum most effective dose? So complete the least amount of work and training, but get the maximal physiological response from it. Are we meeting the player's needs? Are we meeting the current week? Most importantly, are we meeting the technical and tactical requirements of the coach? And does the training meet the current status of our players? Finally, we need to respect fatigue. And typically when we talk about fatigue, we talk about recovery modalities. And there's a multitude of them. The questions you need to ask yourself is, when do I apply which specific recovery modality? Or do I just select 4 or 5 recovery modalities and allow our players select what works best for them, considering we know from research that there's a placebo effect at play with all recovery modalities? When we look at managing this performance training tightrope, we're talking about managing supercompensation. And if we go back to some simple physiology, every time we complete a bout of work with a player, whether it be a warm-up or whether it be a really high intensity bout of work, there's an element of training fatigue that's induced. If we don't recover or we don't give our athletes enough time to flush out that fatigue, we will get a maladaptive response, or we won't supercompensate or adapt appropriately. So we see already we need to manage the stimulus or the dose we're putting into our athletes or the amount of training that they're doing, while also managing the amount of recovery they have so they can supercompensate. If we don't manage training fatigue, over time our athletes will maladapt. And if they consistently maladapt or don't respond positively to training, they will suffer an injury. And this, when we talk about monitoring training load, we need to respect that sports science and the application of strength and conditioning or physiotherapy needs to be a holistic process in nature. And we need to respect the determinants of sporting success within any performance training. And within soccer or football or Gaelic football, we need to understand that all these team sports require a careful and precise execution of skills at high and low intensities. Therefore, our athletes only need to be as fit or as robust to meet the management's requirements of any system you play. For example, if you play a high press when out of possession and a fast transition when in possession, you're going to need to be able to get your athletes robust enough to hit regular high exposures to maximal velocity, complete repeated high intensity efforts, be very competent to changes of direction, and accumulate a lot of high speed running. Ultimately, the aims of any performance training or any training are to develop our players' physiological reserves to be able to perform the specific tasks of the sport. And we want them to perform these tasks with less decay or less fatigue than any opposition we come up against. We also need to ensure that our athletes are robust enough to withstand any calendar demands and ensure that they can meet the technical and tactical demands injury-free and without any breakdown under fatigue. So we need to ensure that we're applying appropriate training loads to our athletes so they can supercompensate and adapt over time. And if we're being very safe with our loading, well, don't be surprised if your athletes break down. When we look at training load then, and to get into this nitty-gritty topic, we have to define it first. And training load is ultimately the dose or any prescribed exercise that we impart on our athletes and its effect on their fitness and fatigue status and their injury risk. Ultimately, this can be monitored through many constructs of loading or many types of loading. Typically, we look at internal and external loading, and I'll talk about them later. When we look at training load, Bannister in 1975 proposed that any exercise we impart on our athletes creates a fitness and fatigue response. And it's the appropriate management of fitness and fatigue that will lead to performance on any given match day. Ultimately, monitoring is completed to determine the required training that we need to complete in order to improve performance and reduce injury risk. What we need to understand is that when we're dealing with a multitude of athletes, there will always be both positive and negative adaptive responses to training. And that's why we need to look at multiple measures of loading to understand how each athlete is responding. When we look at training load, then we need to understand it's the interaction of training intensity. So how hard are we working with respect to maybe percentage heart rate max or session RPE? And we need to realize that training intensity is different for each individual because of different genetic factors and different weighting factors. We also need to respect that training load needs to encompass training volume. So the amount of training we're completing in terms of the amount of sessions we're completing per week, and also typically just the amount of minutes we're on pitch. Finally, then we need to understand training density. So if we have a 60-minute session, how many drills are we completing in that session? If we complete, say, 5 drills in a 60-minute session, that might be a low density session. But if we complete 10 drills within a 60-minute session, that would be a high density session. So how much are you cramming into your training session and how dense do those movements look like? If we look at this then in terms of monitoring, we look at it across 2 objective variables and probably a subjective variable. If we look at internal load, so this is any internal or psychological response to training, we can monitor this through 2 constructs, a subjective construct and an objective construct. We look at subjective monitoring of internal load. We look at rating of perceived exertion, or very simply, how hard an athlete found a session. We might look at this on a 1 through 10 scale, a 6 through 20 scale, or a 0 through 100 scale. Typically, we get our athletes to rate how hard they feel that session was, 10 to 15 or maybe 20 minutes post session, and then we multiply that by the time spent on pitch, and that gives us our session RP or our session RP training impulse. Additionally, if we don't like subjective, because we know athletes sometimes don't report honestly and they suffer from the boy who cried wolf, for example, where if I rate a session as a 7, my friend beside me might rate a session as a 6 because he wants to feel a little bit more, I suppose, fitter than I am. We might go more objective with our monitoring and look at a very black and white measurement of heart rate. Again, typically here we're putting a polar heart rate strap on our athletes. We're looking at time spent over different percentages of heart rate max, or we might look at a more individualized method of maybe training impulse if we're lucky to get some physiological measures on our athletes. Additionally then, and probably the most commonly used measure of training load is this external load, and it's measured through GPS analysis. Typically most units are valid and reliable through research, but we always need to remember that the individuals associated with those research papers with respect to validity and reliability, do they have any vested interest in those papers? Typically, a unit of 10 hertz plus will provide you with valid and reliable data, but I recommend that every practitioner engages in their own validity and reliability studies at the start of every season, just to ensure that the unit they have isn't suffering from any time decay and accuracy. When we look at external load, we typically look at 3 different types of loading. So we look at level 1 metrics, which are our typical distances and distances covered over different speeds. We look at our level 2 variables, which are any changes in speed, so accelerations, decelerations, changes of direction or repeated efforts. And then our level 3 are our micro inertial sensor data, which might look like player load, dynamic stress load if you've stat sports, or it might look at maybe some vector load if you have ADI. Again, we're looking at combining internal and external load, and then those response variables through wellness measurements to get a contextual understanding of where athletes currently lie, so we can manipulate them through the season to ensure that they don't get injured. And the reason we do this is because if you think about sports, it's really an iceberg that's at play all the time. And we see these different movements when we're on the pitch with our athletes, whether it be during match play or whether it be a training. We see high speed running, we see sprinting, we see max speed production, changes of direction, we see technical and tactical skill execution. And if we're unfortunate, we see injuries. But we need to understand that there's a multitude of variables that impact our ability impact our athletes' ability, to complete all these performances. And these highlighted in red, a subtle change in these can have a butterfly effect on our ability to produce high-speed running, for example. So we know from Gaelic football that changes in sleep quality, muscle soreness, and stress, for example, impact our athletes' ability to produce high-speed running in training. And these metrics in red are probably the reasons why training load has become so popular, is because the ability to monitor our athletes provides us direction and how we need to move our athletes through a training calendar. But I think we need to have more context and respect how the athletes present to us and not be too data driven when we look at this. But when we look at why training load monitoring has become so popular, it's because subtle changes in these measures in red here can have an impact on performance in training and performance in match play. And this is highlighted by a nice study by Kate Slattery, who split AFL players into 2 groups of a higher loading group and a lower loading group prior to completing a simulated match play performance. The higher load group completed an additional yo-yo performance during the week to overload them. And what they found is that prior to match play, that higher load group had increases in muscle damage, increases in inflammatory markers, and an increase of their own perception of how the game was going to play out. Additionally, during match play, that higher load group had lower sprint performance, lower repeat sprint performance, lower high speed running. And then recovery between games was actually increased. So there's an increase in recovery time or return to baseline, or that ability to super compensate out of the game was increased due to increases in inflammation and increases in oxidative stress. So if we don't get our loading appropriately, we can actually have a massive impact on how our athletes perform on any given Saturday or Sunday or any match play performance that is coming up within the calendar. And a little small research study we did within our own group in my PhD was we looked at every week during the year and we split our RPE loads into weeks where we won and weeks where we lost. And typically in losing weeks, we had higher loads. And these little subtle questions that we asked of our data allowed us to inform our coaches that maybe less is more. And if we do less during the week, we can give ourselves a better chance of winning in match play, which is ultimately what we're there to do and what coaches will pay most attention to. So why do we monitor training? So again, any monitoring that we do stems from an appropriate training plan. And what I mean by an appropriate training plan is the year should be planned, the months should be planned, and the week should be planned well in advance of them taking place. This planning, however, should be agile in nature. And what I mean by that is that athletes should be able to be pulled or modified based on context and how their data feels so that we get the most appropriate dose or the most appropriate training into our athletes. When we look at dose, we're monitoring that internal load that I talked about from a heart rate and session RP perspective, and also that external load in terms of maybe game minutes, training minutes, and also GPS. And the reason we do that is if we get the most appropriate dose, we'll get a positive fitness response. Or if we get the dose wrong, we'll get a negative maladaptive fatigue response. And if we've more fatigue going into match play, well, then that's going to impact our performance. And ultimately, every training week we complete is this process in play, and there's always a feedback loop, not only for every session, but also for every game and for every training week. And every person within our stakeholders and our backroom team need to know what the training plan is. So we can modify athletes, we can ensure that we're getting the most out of our training session, and we're maximizing our exposure time with our athletes. You have a finite amount of time with your athletes per week. If you don't have the most appropriate training plan and you're not managing that dose and response, you're not going to get a positive performance at the weekend. And that feedback loop is going to continue throughout a season, and you're going to end up with a poor performance across the season. When we look at managing training load, though, we need to respect the coaching philosophy. And this is one of the key things, is that we like to think that we plan training and we plan the training loads, but it's the coach that ultimately applies the loads to our athletes. If we can't plan around that coaching philosophy and take a walk in our coach's shoes every now and then, well, then they're not going to reciprocate that and take a walk in our shoes when we go, this player needs to be modified today because he or she is flagging on external, internal, and wellness measures. Additionally, we need to sit down and chat to our coaches regularly and understand what is their football philosophy, because that will impact the physiological targets of our program. It will also impact the percentage of game demands that we're working at in training and the percentage of required loading that we need to get into our athletes. When I talk about percentage game demands, I talk about looking at GPS data and referencing it against match play numbers, whether that be from an intensity perspective with respect to meters per minute, or that be looking at volume with respect to what is the percentage volume we're getting from this drill when compared to the same segment of match play. Again, when I talk about training load, I'm talking about understanding volume, intensity, and density. And when we look at the coaching process, if we look at how we manipulate volume, it's typically we manipulate volume based on training day, based on the drill type. If the drill has a high quality to it and there's not a lot of turnovers and not a lot of breakdown, there typically will be a higher volume and a higher intensity. Do we want to overload our athletes with respect to volume? Yes or no? That would dictate the type of drills that we want to run and also the volume of the session. Again, that tactical periodization focus will also dictate the volume and intensity that's taking place. When we look at intensity of drills, then typically you'll look at pitch size, player number, work to rest ratios, the player experience. Is there big goals, small goals? Is it a possession-based drill? And when we look at density, then again, the number of efforts athletes are completing, typically this is directed by both volume and intensity and all the attributes in green. But what we also need to understand is this contextual piece, which is the yellow here. So the volume and intensity our athletes complete will be dictated by their previous game minutes, how much fatigue they're carrying in, what was their pre-training status looking like. Is there goalkeepers or no goalkeepers within the drill? What's their previous loading looking like across a 7, 10 and 14-day period? What is the player motivation going into this training session? What are the conditions of the game? Is it one touch, no touch? Is it free play? Is there quick ball replacement? And what is the training environment like? Additionally, we can contextually manipulate the intensity and volume in training. If we're lucky to have live GPS analysis between drills, we can feed back to our athletes in terms of what is the percentage of game demands from this drill, and we can go, we're either above or below that required game demand output of the drill. And we found within our environment, when we feed back to our athletes post drills, when we go to our players, we go, the last drill was below our typical game demands. Post that, we typically see an increase in intensity within subsequent drills. But we need to respect the coaching philosophy when monitoring our athletes and when looking at sound principles with respect to the application of sports science. And this comes into this piece of managing our player bandwidth. And every player has a performance bandwidth. And what I mean by that is every player has the ability to maximally or negatively respond to training. And we need to respect that both our wellness status and external stressors can decrease that performance adaptation. And we're always looking to find that minimum effective dose where we get the maximal response to training by completing the smallest amount of work in training. And what we can see here in the red are all the contextual factors that can impact our ability as practitioners to find that minimum effective dose for athletes. For example, what are the positional demands of the player? Is there specific target work-ons for them? What's their current status from an internal and external load perspective? Are they a starter or non-starter? What is their talent level? Because sometimes we'll manage our most talented players because we know that they're going to be our game winners. What are the physical qualities of the player? Because we know that increased strength, increased speed, and increased repeated speed protect our athletes from injury. What's the training content looking like? Is it an intensive or a more expansive training session? Or is it a tight training session where there's going to be lots of accelerations and decelerations? And that brings us nicely to what's the previous injury history of our athletes? Do we manage guys who have more groin and hip issues away from tighter drills at particular time points during the year because we know they're important players for us? And sometimes that actually has to happen. We need to make sure that we're data informed and not data driven. We always need to respect how the athlete presents to us and what their data is looking like, but also having those conversations with the coach, with the physio, and then finally with the athlete themselves. For example, some of our athletes flag for high speed running spikes, for total distance spikes, and they might have poor wellness status. And we'll have a conversation with them and they'll go, look, I really want to train today, but if you wouldn't mind modifying my minutes. And we'll go to the coach, go, this player wants to be modified for minutes. And then that's how we work. We don't just go, your data is spiked, you're being pulled from training today. We take multiple data points and multiple data sources in addition to a conversation with the athlete and the coach before making a decision on whether an athlete should train or not. And typically when we look at training load and its application on a day-to-day basis, it falls within a high performance management model. And what I mean by that is that we always look to strive to get our athletes to perform on game day. And it's always looking at game day backwards, whether that be in terms of how we load, we taper into game day because game day is really, really important. We have different loading schemes for match day minus or match day plus. We have different loading schemes, or we have different training session content based on maybe the management style or what way they want to work for that week. But if we look at a high performance model, it always starts with game day performance. But we need to respect the management style and the coaching systems that they want to play, because that dictates the physical requirements we need to get into our athletes. For example, I go back to it. If we play a high press when out of possession and a quick transition when in possession, we need to ensure that our athletes can have and be exposed and tolerate high exposures to max speed, a lot of high speed running, be able to accumulate and tolerate good acceleration and deceleration, and be able to consistently repeat high speed running efforts across quarters. Again, once we understand the tactical system, we can then begin to understand what training interventions we as practitioners need to employ with our athletes to ensure that they can meet the physical requirements. Then we look at what monitoring systems can we employ. Are these going to be objective or subjective in nature? Because that allows us to dictate the amount of training or the training dose that we put into our athletes. And if we're lucky to be able to monitor that live, if our athletes don't get the appropriate exposure, well, then we top our athletes up at the end of training with maybe some conditioning stimuluses or additional small-sided games. What we need to make sure is that we're always monitoring the response, however, to these training interventions. Over time, you should be looking at your match day -1, your match day +2, and every match day or every training session and see, is it similar to previous training sessions? What's the wellness response coming out of that training? So then we can understand that for us on a Tuesday is our high loading day. We can go, that's typically above or below our typical Tuesday with respect to internal and external load. And on the Wednesday, then look at how our athletes respond with respect to wellness and go, that's typically what we see, or this is a bit of an outlier. And then we can contact that player and see how he or she is getting on. And the reason we monitor response is to manage player readiness to train. Because if players don't train appropriately, they're not going to get a positive physiological response from training. They're going to have an increased risk of injury because they're not fit enough or they're not strong enough to play the game. But overall, that will impact their ability to maximize game day performance. Once we're managing player readiness, then we hopefully can link in with our coaches on training content and training coordination. And what I mean by that is, what are we doing post a warm-up? Is there a physical block with respect to maybe maximal speed exposures or acceleration-based work? Post that, are we going into small-sided games, or are we going into 11v11 match play, or are we going into maybe 9v9 match play on a full pitch with different conditions? Is there going to be a conditioning element within our training today? And the reason we're doing that is to, again, appropriately manage the dose and ensure that we're getting the maximal stimulus from training. Additionally, by programming and having appropriate training content coordination, we can increase our knowledge, or our players' knowledge, of the systems we want to play. And again, that comes back to appreciating the management style and the technical and tactical systems they want to play. Finally, then, our goal is to link in with our management and ensure that our players are executing the skills of the game at increased game speed or above match play demands. So we would typically look at on a Tuesday, if we run 6 drills, having 5 of those drills above 100% of match play demands. We would typically monitor total distance in meters per minute and reference that against our players' meters per minute in match play. In addition to that, we look at high speed running, high metabolic load, and then acceleration-based distance, or acceleration numbers, per minute. And the reason we're doing that is we're trying to maximize our athletes or our players' readiness to perform. So within this model, we're monitoring our athletes to maximize training performance and maximize game day performance. If your athlete doesn't train consistently and you're always modifying their minutes on pitch, don't be surprised if they're underloaded or underexposed. And then during the most important phase of play or during a really intense phase of play, they break down with either a groin niggle, a calf niggle, a hamstring, or a quad, or a non-contact injury. And these are the injuries we as practitioners need to be able to prevent, for want of a better term. But prevention is just preparing your athletes to meet and exceed the demands of the game. I can stop here for questions if you want, just on that first piece, Dan, or I can continue on.
I think we can stop there, and I don't have any current questions. Ni får gärna skriva i chattfunktionen om det är några frågor. Meanwhile, I have one question for you, Shane.
Yeah.
With your experience, what is the absolute the most important as a sports scientist to affect the players in reducing risk of injury and top up performance? If you would,
I think there's two key prongs and two key aspects to that. Firstly, I think we need to ensure that our athletes have the appropriate athletic capacities. So we need to test our athletes and ensure that they're strong enough relative to their own body weight, that they have the appropriate aerobic performance to repeat performance and recover well. But contextually, you need to have a good working relationship with your coach and your physio and also your athletes. If you're just looking at data all the time and you're managing an athlete based on his numbers that are coming into you, you will miss the point and you will miss so many contextual factors that increase risk of injury. And we'll delve into these in the next section, but it's not just about external load and internal load and wellness data. It's about also respecting the external stressors within the environment, how an athlete is at home, and understanding where the coach sees the athlete in the next, say, 14 to 21 days in terms of their training and in terms of their match play performance. So, for example, if an athlete is a key starter and they're always accumulating 90 minutes of football, sometimes that is enough. And athletes, if they're flagging for fatigue or they're flagging for wellness, we can modify their training minutes. But we don't manage our whole program on, for example, an acute chronic workload ratio or a percentage variance or a CMJ performance. We manage it on multiple variables, and we're data informed rather than data driven, because a data informed practitioner, and I'll talk about that later, respects context, and context is the key here. If you can't operate with your management team or with your manager or your coach and understand what he or she wants to complete with their athletes, well, you won't have a job for very long, because you'll always be fighting with them. You'll always be like, oh, well, he or she doesn't listen to me. Whereas if you have a conversation, say during a training, post a training drill, and go, well, what do you think you're getting from that drill? And they go, well, I think I'm getting high speed running, or I think I'm working our athletes under pressure. And you can go, well, if you actually modified this drill and you maybe put made the dimensions a little bit bigger, and you took a player out, then they're going to get more touches on the ball. They're going to get more exposure to football performance, and they're going to get execution of skills under more pressure. We need to be able to talk to our coaches in a similar language, and we need to be able to feed back our sports science data in really simple to understand graphs, because coaches sometimes, like, I think we need to appreciate that sometimes players and coaches don't really care about what we do, but we need to try and educate them that we're trying to improve them every time they step on the pitch.
Good answer. Har vi några frågor så får ni gärna komma med dem i chatten där, som sagt. So one more question for you, Shane. Have you experienced, of course you have experienced different type of coaching or management styles and different types of culture.
Yeah.
Can you just mention some like examples of that and how you adapted and you adapted your way of communicate data or other things?
When I like everyone, we start at the very bottom of the pile in terms of our level of importance, and we come out of college and we think we know it all, and maybe we do a master's or a PhD and we come out of that and we probably think, well, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. But I remember in my first job, which was again in Gaelic football, my PhD was linked with another Gaelic football team, and GPS was new, and even sports science application was kind of new to coaches at the time. And there was a very hostile reaction to everything we were trying to do. So coaches were like, oh, why are you monitoring total distance? Why is that important? Why are you capping my training minutes? Why are you saying that my drill is too intense? And it was very hostile. But over time, it's these little corridor conversations, or even if you're at dinner or you're at lunch or even at breakfast in the morning with your coaches. I know that can't happen now, but in any interaction you have with your coach, you need to try and maximize that as an educational opportunity and an opportunity to reduce the hostility that they have towards what you're trying to do. So for example, what we did with our skills coach at the time, who absolutely hated GPS, he had no time for it at all. He had no interest in monitoring RPE. He didn't care about anything that we did. So at every training session, I made it my business to sit beside him when we were eating dinner and just go these simple questions of like even a simple introduction of that was a great training session tonight. The players worked really, really hard. And you go, I'm expecting the GPS to show that we were working really, really hard and we should be above what we put out in match play. And then he'll come back and go, oh geez, this confirms what I want to see. And if we can confirm what they want to see, they'll buy into it a little bit more. So, and again, when we look at drills, I started a drill database for that coach, and I just went halfway through the year and I go, here's all your drills for the average outputs of every player. I said, you can split that by position if you want. And he began to respect that it describes exactly what he wants to do in his drill, but just from a physical perspective. And he also, it was interesting, he actually got a little bit greedy or really interested in it when he was like, oh, I have a few presentations coming up myself. Can you please cut that GPS data and give it to me? And I sort of said to him, gee, we've come full circle. You're now really, really interested in sports science and GPS and how it can educate people. But I think we just need to have those conversations and break down the barriers with the coach. We need to respect that they will see us as being a hostile presence within the group, but we just need to sit down, understand where they're coming from, understand that not everything that they do is bad, and also hopefully they respect that not everything we do is about getting athletes off the pitch. Again, I think that's really, really important, is that if we know an athlete needs to be pulled, we need to be 100% sure, 200% sure, 300% sure, and 400% sure that it's the right decision. We need to review our decision 4 or 5 times before we make a final commitment on that decision. And if we're managing our athletes based on multiple data points, we get a more clearer picture of what's going on versus just going, his acute chronic is 1.3, he cannot train today because there's a risk of injury. Because we know, based on literature, that not all research is robust. And we know that the acute chronic has multiple flaws. So we need to make sure that the measures we're picking are valid, reliable, and sensitive to change. But when we're chatting with our coaches, we need to try and be friendly with them, understand where they're coming from, and then over time they will actually respond and reciprocate and understand where you're coming from. And that's been my experience, and that's working with skilled coaches in Gaelic football all the way up to the likes of Joe Schmidt and Andy Farrell with the RFU. They're all very similar. They're all very type 1 personalities about it's their way or no way. And I think if we can sit down with them and educate them on where we're trying to come from and try and sell it from that, like, we're trying to get your players on the pitch all the time so you can improve them, then they'll reciprocate and respond better to us than us just going, this player needs to be pulled, that player needs to be pulled, that drill isn't good enough, that drill is terrible, this doesn't look like anything we're doing. Instead of highlighting flaws and highlighting problems, we need to highlight solutions.
Yeah, another good answer. Thank you. There's no question here at the moment, so being very clear in your presentation, Shane.
Perfect. So, do you want me to continue, or do you want to take a 5-minute break? Or
I think we can take a 5-minute break, so okay. We can start again. Like, yeah, we can do it. We can take. Excuse me.
We'll start back at 7. Sorry, your time, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, we can say 7 and then we have a 3-minute break. Och under pausen så får ni gärna skriva, och ni kan skriva under tiden Shane presenterar också, så ni får svar på era frågor. Det viktigaste är att ni som lyssnare får svar på det ni kommer för att höra eller få reda på, även om det går utanför hans presentation. Så gärna några frågor i chattforumet där, så ses vi tillbaks här om 3 minuter. Yes, Shane.
Yeah.
I think you can proceed.
Perfect. So in the second part of the talk, we'll talk about kind of training performance injury associations. So some of the stuff that's been highlighted within Gaelic football and some of the stuff that we know from other research groups. We'll also highlight some of the issues with this kind of research area, and then I'll give a practical example, in terms of how we would manage training load with our athletes in terms of a number of dashboards with respect to Excel integration with GPS and player wellness into Power BI. So when we look at training performance and injury associations, we need to really dial it back to what are our goals as practitioners. And our goal is to ensure that our athletes can meet the requirements of play. And what are the requirements of any sport? It's to be repeatable in terms of you can repeat efforts, you can repeat performance consistently across different matches and different training sessions. We need them to be durable so they can link multiple training sessions together, because we know from research in the AFL, which shows the more preseason training athletes complete, the less likely they are to get injured. That in turn needs them to be more robust. And also, the more fit and the more physiologically robust they are, the quicker athletes recover between efforts, but also the quicker they recover between training sessions. If we look at the requirements to play any sport, we can look at it from physical, physiological, and technical and tactical. So if we look at physiological, do our athletes have the appropriate aerobic system, or VO2 max, or aerobic power to perform multiple efforts within match play? Do they have the appropriate lactate kinetics? Do they have the appropriate energy system utilization? Do they have biomechanical tolerance to running demands so that they don't break down during different running movements? Do they have the appropriate running economy? Do they have a cardiovascular tolerance so that they can stave off fatigue or keep fatigue away for as long as possible? And then that links in, do they have the appropriate mitochondrial content or mitochondrial tolerance at a cellular level? From a physical perspective, are they strong enough? Do they have the appropriate power capacity? Do they have the appropriate force velocity curve? Can they repeat high intensity efforts consistently? Do they have high speed running tolerance? Do they have an appropriate acceleration capacity? Do they have the ability to interlink high speed running efforts? And do they have the ability to consistently produce maximal velocity efforts? The technical and the tactical is more for our coaches, but we need to be aware of what are the technical and tactical requirements in order to build a dominant football player, but also manage training load and manage training content appropriately. When we look at managing load and managing injury risk, we can look at this from a 6-stage process. And this is a model we produced as a research group, myself, Mark Rowe, and other colleagues, where we broke it into 6 key stages. So as a practitioner, you need to understand the injury trends of your sport. What are the most common injuries and what are the most common injury sites? Is it contact or non-contact injury? Is it lower limb injuries? Is it upper limb injuries? What are the appropriate risk factors then that we need to consider within the sport? For example, we'll highlight them on the next slide. There's a multitude of risk factors associated with Gaelic football, and those increase or decrease our injury risk depending on what factor is there. Do we know the sporting demands with respect to the training week, the typical running demands? What are they like based on position? What are they like based on the age of the athlete? What is the athletic profile? What is the athlete profile in terms of what is their running capacity? What's their strength capacity? Then we begin the process of athlete management. How much training can they complete? When do they need to be modified? How are we modifying our athletes? Why are we modifying our athletes? And what data in terms of athlete monitoring are we using to modify or manage our athletes? And this cycle is holistic and repetitive in nature, whether it be at the start of a season, whether it be mid-season, or whether it be every day. We need to understand what are the current injury trends within our squad, what are the risk factors for those injuries, what's the current demands of the sport, what is the athlete profile as he or she presents in front of me, what data am I going to use to either get them to train or to manage them appropriately. When we look at different risk factors within elite Gaelic football, there's a multitude of research papers, and I recommend you to do this with any sport that you're involved in, is look at what are the factors that increase injury risk within your sport. For example, in Gaelic football, if you have a previous injury, you're 3 times more likely to get injured. If you have a previous hamstring injury, you're nearly 4 times more likely to get injured. If you have 14 exposures or 14 sprints per week, you're 4 times or 5 times more likely to get injured. If you have a high exposure to session RPE load, again, your risk is amplified. If you have a very slow time trial performance or a poor aerobic capacity, you're 2 times more likely to get injured. And again, there's other injury risk factors such as an adductor squeeze or a groin squeeze, and also a hamstring squeeze, where if different scores are found, they can increase our injury risk. So this is true of all sports. There's a multitude of factors that increase injury. So the question is, why are we managing our athletes based on either one data point or maybe 2 or 3 data points? We need to appreciate the data and also the context and understand the factors that increase injury risk, throw them all into our decision making, and then make the most appropriate decision for our athletes. And the reason I talk about understanding context is we need to maximize the interaction that we have with our athletes. We've only so many exposure hours per player per year that we need to maximize. So for example, in Gaelic football, it's a heavily training-based training process. So we are at fault 9 times out of 10 if an athlete gets injured as a practitioner, because we can control the training intensity, the training content, and the training volume that our athletes are completing. It's the same in football, though, in your environment. You need to maximize the interactions you have on a training basis in order to ensure that your athletes survive within match play. And by maximizing those interactions and by understanding the data, understanding the athlete as they present in front of you, you will mitigate injury risk or reduce injury risk. We can look at this then in 3 different prongs. So we talked about the 6-stage model previously, but if we look at this in, again, a more condensed fashion, we need to understand the player capacity. So we need to test our player probably 3 or 4 times during the year. We need to select appropriate testing bandwidths then, or appropriate standards that we feel will protect our athletes against injury, but also improve their likelihood to be successful in match play. When we look at our tests, if it's a running test, we need to make sure it's valid, reliable, and sensitive to change over time. And typically we see tests such as the yo-yo 1 or 2, the 30-15, there might be a 1K time trial or a time trial variant, or there might be a Bronco time trial, which is a 1.2K shuttle of 20 meters out back, 40 meters out back, and 60 meters out and back, completed 5 times. The reason we're trying to understand our capacity is to understand the aerobic fitness quality of our athletes, or that maximal aerobic speed. We need to understand their strength qualities, how quick they are. We can do that off GPS, and how repeatable they are through maybe a 6x35 repeated sprint assessment. When we look at training demands, then we need to monitor and communicate these appropriately. So what are we monitoring and why are we monitoring? Maybe internal, external load. When we communicate, we're communicating on training construction, training content flow, training total time, because we know very simply, if we know technology tomorrow, the most easiest way to manage exposure and dose and response is by manipulating time on pitch and time on feet. And by doing that, we get an appropriate training plan and we get less spikes in load or less changes in load. And one of the key things we need to also monitor and respect is the injury risk factors. We all need to ensure that our physios and our medical team are completing medical injury audits, how much modified training is taking place within our group, how much time are athletes losing to injury, and what increases the likelihood of injury within your group and what reduces or moderates that. These can be done, like a simple injury audit can be conducted on Excel. If you look at Excel tricks for sport, you can build a simple medical injury audit that produces your contact, your non-contact injury, your total time loss, and your total time in modified training. So very simple interventions can lead to really data-rich environments. When we look at testing, I think it links in nicely to understanding the needs of your sport. And as a practitioner, one of your key things is understanding performance and the sporting needs. And once we understand the needs, we can select appropriate tests. Then we can complete the test, present the results, and then begin our program of intervention. And the reason we try to understand athletic capacities is to provide data on the current status of the athlete and also respect their current physical and physiological status. It will also aid us and assist us with decision-making within our program in terms of manipulating athletes in and out of different drills, or maybe intervening with an athlete to try and improve whether it be physical or physiological qualities. It provides objective information. It takes the emotion out of anything that we're doing. If you just report on data and you say, look, these are the numbers, this is what it's like versus the last time we tested, he's 10% down, she's 5% down on where she was last year. Keep it very objective. Don't get emotionally involved with what the data says. Assess the impact of any interventions you might run. So if you test and you never retest, how do you know if your program has been effective? If it's not effective and you don't, or if it's not effective and you don't test, you'll never know. Finally, why we test is to maximize athlete and coach understanding. So they understand where they need to get to versus the standards you've set, and the coach also understands where the athlete currently is. So if you're modifying an athlete after a heavy block of work, you can go back and go, well, he has poor strength levels. He typically has a poor rear chain capacity in terms of his Nordic assessment. He has a poor aerobic fitness, so he probably is going to take a little bit longer to recover out of those 2 or 3 heavy training sessions that we did. The coach then understands, because it's simple black and white data presented in front of them that you're using to inform your decision making. You're not doing it, you're not going, well, this and this has happened, these are data points, he cannot train. You're going, we're recommending that he maybe be modified today. So when we look at it from our perspective at Dublin, we break our assessments into running capacity, speed, force, velocity, jump, and then strength assessments. So our running capacity assessment is a Bronco time trial. So again, that shuttle-based assessment. We then look at speed, so a maximum velocity exposure, how quickly are you on GPS? And again, GPS has been shown to be a valid and reliable measure of maximum velocity. If you don't believe me, look at Gregory Rowe's work in the area. It's really, really good. We then look at our anaerobic speed reserve, so that maximal aerobic speed that they get in a Bronco versus their maximal velocity or their top end speed. We look at a force velocity profile on a jump just to understand force velocity deficiency. We look at jump height and a CMJ, and we look at reactive strength index in terms of a reactive bound off a box. Our strength assessment then is both upper and lower limb. So we do a 1RM bench press, and we look at that relative to the individual's weight. We do a upper limb pull in terms of a chin up, a closed grip chin up. We do a 3RM on that weighted chin. We do a squat or a trot bar depending on any contraindications that athletes have based on a physiotherapy assessment at the start of the season. We do 3RM on lower limb for 2 reasons. One, the 3RM can be predicted out to a 1RM quite accurately, and also we want to reduce the amount of accumulated neuromuscular fatigue that our athletes get through strength training. Additionally, then we look at rear chain strength through a Nordic fallout assessment, and also an isometric flat prone isometric hold into the Nordic cell. Like I said, we then set specific bandwidths for our athletes in terms of what is poor, average, good, and excellent for our different capacities. So for example, for upper and lower limb strength, this is the amount or times body weight that our athletes typically have to hit, or the reactive strength and jump height they need to hit in order to be deemed ideally excellent. So this is what we show to our athletes, and this is what we communicate at the start of the year. And then this is what we feed back to them. So obviously this has been anonymized for obvious reasons, but this is an example of a radar plot that we would have for our athletes in terms of different profiles, in terms of our body composition, our upper limb push, upper limb pull, our RSI, our rear chain strength, our maximal speed qualities. And we feed back to our athletes not only to educate them on where they may be deficient, but also inform them where they're strong. So for example, this athlete has 2 main deficiencies that he needs to work on, which is his RSI and his body comp. So he needs to improve his muscle mass or his lean body mass, because he's quite a light athlete. He's about 75 kilos, but he has 63 kilos of lean body mass. But what we also want to do with this athlete is tell him or any athlete we work with, we want you to maintain where you're strong. So in the gym, when we're programming for you, we're programming you to keep you strong. Why do we want to keep you strong? We want to keep you strong because we know that stronger athletes are less likely to get injured. And again, this reiterates the point. This is times body weight in a trap bar deadlift research we completed within hurling players. And we found that stronger athletes were less likely to get injured than weaker athletes. So for example, in a trap bar deadlift, if your athlete can only lift 1.7 to 2.4 times their body weight, they're 2 times more likely to get injured than an athlete who can lift 3 times their body weight. Additionally, then, we see here 5, 10 meter speed and 20 meter speed in terms of that left to right look at this graph. We see the quicker you are over 5, 10 and 20 meters, the less likely you are to get injured. So if you've good acceleration based capacities, the more you can tolerate those acceleration capacities, the less likely you are to get injured. Finally, then, in the top right hand corner, the more repeatable you are and the quicker you are over a repeated sprint test, the less likely you are to get injured. So what we need to understand here is that when we're looking at physical qualities, we're looking at typically univariate or single variate analysis. But what they do is they provide us with different targets that we can look at within our program in order to protect our athlete from injury. So for example, we look to get our athletes strong, fast, tolerate acceleration, get them lean in terms of get them have them high lean body mass, low percentage body fat, so they can move more effectively across the ground and be less likely to get injured. When we look at running performance, there has been this kind of push towards time trials within Gaelic football. I'm not too sure with respect to soccer. I presume it's yo-yos and 30-15s. But if we look at gold standard in terms of probably the most valid and reliable all the way down to the least valid and reliable, typically treadmill tests are the most valid and reliable. There is questions over their applicability within team-based sports though, because we know that VO2 max, while important for protecting athletes against injury and their ability to recover, it's probably not related to actual team play performance. But what we use these tests for is as a box ticking exercise to ensure that our athletes are coming back in the same shape as they have previously, improving across the year. The better yo-yo and even 30-15 performance they have, the less likely they are to get injured. Improvements in your time trial performance in Gaelic football, for example, has been shown to reduce your likelihood of injury. So for example, aerobic fitness protects against massive increases in training load, and we showed that within Gaelic football previously. We also showed that athletes who are quicker or have a better maximal aerobic speed score can also handle higher loads throughout a training week. So the fitter you are, the more you can handle training, the more you recover quickly from training, and the better you can handle any changes in load. So having a fit team or a team that can run appropriately and meet the demands of their game and of training and the demands of the coach will likely lead to a group that has less injuries. This is interesting now. We did a study on GPS analysis, and basically when you look at this, you see 1 weekly load is associated with injury for total distance, high speed running, high metabolic load, and average metabolic power. But if you look down all these 4 graphs, you will see odds risks that are high across all the variables, whether it be 2 weekly load, 3 weekly load, 4 weekly load, and acute chronic. And again, what we're seeing here in terms of the area under the curve analysis is that there's multiple models you can create if you're smart enough to understand external loads association with injury. And unfortunately, us as practitioners can't consistently look at 1 weekly load, 2 weekly load, 3 weekly load, 4 weekly load, acute chronics, high speed running, acute chronics, any metric acute chronics. And all those, you're basically, there's 220 metrics that can come off GPS, and probably all those 220 metrics have some association with injury at some point. So what you have to do as a practitioner is you need to look at the GPS, the metrics. You need to look at all the metrics you're collecting, understand their validity, their reliability, their sensitivity to change, and pick a couple of metrics to manage your players off of within your training process. Otherwise, you'll get lost in numbers. And if you are very data driven, you will lose the context of everything as well. And on top of that, and when we look at this, we're looking to complete these research studies to understand mediators, or things that increase injury risk, and moderators, or things that decrease injury risk. And once we understand those things, we then try to appreciate the context or the environment within which we are sitting, and then we manage specific players. So for example, what do we know increases injury risk? Low workload exposure. Always modifying your players will increase their risk of injury. Poor aerobic fitness, poor anaerobic fitness, poor strength levels, consistent exposure to changes in load or massive spikes in load, and previous injury and age. What are moderators of load? If we can increase our aerobic fitness of our athletes, get them to link sessions together, understand what high chronic load looks like for each athlete, and make sure that they're consistently hitting that. Moderate training experience will also decrease risk. So if they survive after year one and they don't break down, as they accumulate more years, they will typically have less risk of injury. Again, we can also look at the idea that spiking is poor, but you have to spike your loads in order to adapt physiologically. No one adapts physiologically by completing the same load over time. So again, submaximal spikes in load and exposure to them will increase, will decrease your injury risk within your athlete cohort. And I come back to it again, and I come back to managing athletes. And I think because of the literature that has taken place with respect to training load, I think everyone has become too safe when they're planning training. So if you look at this is just a hypothetical situation of the red line is the genetic potential of any athlete across their whole playing career. And the black line is what happens if we consistently underload or modify our athlete when he or she doesn't need to be modified, or if we manage our program off one metric. And typically, I think because of the amount of research that people are reading now, and probably the over inflation of importance of metrics like the acute chronic of percentage variance in load, I think we're falling in the middle here where we're not actually getting our athletes to their genetic potential in terms of their ability to improve aerobically, anaerobically, and physically in terms of technically and tactically throughout their playing career. And the reason I think we're being too safe is we're over-reliant on data, and we're failing to appreciate the context over time. And what that's resulting in is it's resulting of a non-appropriateness of training. And if training isn't appropriate, and if we focus too much on data, it can lead us in multiple directions. It can lead us away from managing our athlete to be the best they can be. It can lead us to having an athlete that is always fresh and always fully recovered and never has been exposed to any overload. And if that happens, we're actually placing our athletes at more risk of injury over time. And the reason I talk about us being too focused on data is because we're coming into an era of two different practitioners, of practitioners that are heavily driven by data and they only focus on data-driven decisions, and other practitioners who potentially respect the data but are more data informed. And if we look at a data-driven practitioner, yes, they appreciate validity, reliability, and sensitivity. But unfortunately, if you're too focused on data and you're really interested in data, this data can massage your own bias. You can say the acute chronic is the most important metric out there, or percentage change in load is the most important metric out there, but you have a bias naturally towards that metric. And ultimately, if you're driven by one metric, you fail to respect the context of the environment, you fail to respect the management or coaching needs, and you also fail to respect the individual because you fail to build a relationship with that player. And an interesting thing to consider here is that if we're data driven and we're research driven all the time, well, not all research that's published is robust, and not all research that's published is perfect. And most research is ultimately case study work on one team or case study work on 2 or 3 teams. So what we need to do is we need to understand that research is only important to the individuals who read it. And typically coaches and players do not read research and don't care about research. They're interested in how you read the research and how you apply it in your own context. And that's why I would encourage everyone on this call to be a data-informed practitioner. Yes, respect validity, reliability, sensitivity, but use multiple measures for your understanding of where a player is currently at. Make sure that it fits the individual as they present in front of you. Always build a relationship with the athlete, and also build a relationship and respect the coach's needs in your environment. Respect context, and also any research you apply, any research you want to apply, first see if it fits in your own context. No point going in tomorrow and going, maximum velocity exposures are the best thing ever, we need to start sprinting our athletes twice a week, and then you realize you break down with loads of hamstring injuries. You need to make sure that the research you're reading, that you can digest that research and then go, well, where does this fit in my environment? Because the thing that we need to understand is that because literature has been so focused on workload, we fail to appreciate the multitude of variables that can impact injury risk. And it's led to this fox and the hare debate. And Billy Hullen, who's a good colleague of mine, recently released a research paper on this. And basically the main take home was that the appropriate application of performance science is never about one sole measure of internal or external load. There is a multitude of factors that will always impact an athlete's ability to positively respond and stay injury free. And they include stress and anxiety, muscle architecture, perceived well-being, and ultimately that unknown. There's a multitude of things we do not know about an athlete. We only see them for probably a small percentage of their week. And unless we're getting to the stage where we're at this 24-hour monitoring of athletes, there is a multitude of unknowns that we don't know. So we're trying to operate best practice in order to keep our athletes injury-free. And this is an example of respecting context. So if we consider this practically, so you've got three things. You've got before players arrive at training, pre-training prep, and then prior to training. So understanding the context of an athlete's readiness to train. Questions we should be asking prior to or before arrival at training of the data we have. What is the current weekly load versus the previous weekly load at the same stage? So if we're Wednesday in this week, what's the load to this Wednesday versus the previous Wednesday? What's the current external and internal status of our athlete and how are they trending? What is the alteration in any load measure in terms of percentage? Does this fall within or outside any typical change or variation in that metric? What is the plan for today's session? How is the athlete's wellness data trending? Has the athlete provided any specific comments to you on their current change? Prior to training then, we communicate the alterations in status to all the key stakeholders. Make sure that's the athlete and the management. Stakeholder conversation around any important change in athlete trends on an athlete by athlete basis. Athlete assessment when they present to the training base might be as simple as a knee to wall, hamstring squeeze, groin squeeze, or a counter movement jump. Alterations in the assessment need to have a specific intervention. For example, if the hamstring squeeze is down, is there a physio rub out or a massage rub out that an athlete can take place, or what is the specific intervention? If the assessment returns close to baseline levels, then the athlete trains. Okay, if an athlete based on pre-training screens has a decrease, but then post an intervention comes back to baseline, he should train, and that keeps the athletes on the pitch and also keeps you in a favorable position with the coach. Communication of any pre-training assessment data needs to take place with the management for key players of interest. You don't need to go down and go A, B, C, D, and E are fine. Just communicate very specifically. Player X has this issue. He will not be training. Player Y has this issue. He needs to be modified for the last 10 minutes. This then allows you to communicate any alteration in player numbers, and then any modified athletes or modified training status is confirmed with the coach. And then if your athlete is able to train off feet, then you confirm any protocols with that athlete. Again, if we're looking to top our athletes up, we need to respect context and content. So player top-ups is an interesting thing. Strength and conditioning coaches and sports scientists love them. But again, the context of when a player tops up, we need to respect the amount of game minutes they played, how much volume have they completed, what's been the intensity of that, what's the athletic profile of the athlete, how important are they, what's their current weekly loading, are they going to play 90 minutes in the next few days? Remember the bandwidth I talked about. How do we get a really effective minimum dose response? What is the target adaptation? And once we are planning to top up our athletes, we need to have a specific physiological target to that. So is it an aerobic, an anaerobic, or a neuromuscular target? For example, is it a type 1 hit or an MAS run? Is it an MAS run with a change of direction? And then once we have the physiological target ingrained, we then pick the specific conditioning element, whether it be small-sided games, whether it be intervals, long, short, whether it be hybrid circuits, and then we select the number, type, duration, sets, reps, and recovery. But the thing here, and I would suggest this to all practitioners, is we get so little time with our athletes that if we're given the opportunity to top them up, we should target a specific physiological hit rather than looking to get something that's a little bit more specific in nature, such as a small-sided game. I know in my context, Typically, when we top up through small set of games, the intensity of them isn't that great, and the running demands aren't really hit, versus a physiological hit, which is shorter in nature and gets a really strong internal stimulus and can have a positive response over time. I'm going to get into the data feedback system and just finish up the talk with how we feedback data and how it links. So in our data feedback system, we have our manager who's on the far left-hand side, and he has access to all our data at whatever point he wants it. If he wants to look at X player in this drill, we can provide the data to him. But I need to understand that it's not just the management or the manager that I'm responsible for. I'm responsible for different data to different stakeholders. So for example, for my conditioning coach, I need to provide data on planning, on loading. I need to ask the question, are we getting enough through our football? How does that look in a game comparison? What is that as a percentage of game demands? Are we hitting our worst case analysis in terms of, are we hitting the maximal amount of work in training that we complete in 1 minute? Is that similar to the maximal amount of work we complete in 1 minute in match play? And then I link in with my conditioning coach every so often within training and go, these 4 or 5 players need to top up. With respect to the medical and the physio side of things, I'll report any changes in load to them. We'll link really closely with respect to rehab planning. And we do this as a return to play checklist in terms of, have they hit their game demands? Have they hit an appropriate volume? In terms of rehab, have they cleared 65% of a typical week, 75% of a typical week, 85% of a typical week? Have they progressed from really controlled running into more training-based interventions or circuit-based work? For our other management or our selectors, again, they're concerned about player versus player because they link in with the manager in terms of who should start. Again, they're concerned about player numbers because they and the skill coaches link together for drills. So who's ready to change, or ready to train. They're really concerned about who's for top-ups. And then, are we doing enough is a question I always get. Skills coaches then, are my drills at the right speed or right pace? What do players look like within drills? What does the training look like on a drill by drill basis? And what does the drill look like as a percentage of match demands? Then the most key important stakeholder within the group are the players. And they're concerned about leaderboards. Who's completing the most running? Who's completing the most high speed running? What does my percentage of max speed look like? And the reason they're asking all these questions of me is they're really concerned about, when I play at the weekend against my direct opponent, am I ready to play? And I'll now go through different dashboards we have. So we're lucky at Dublin to have Stat Sports and athlete monitoring as our internal and external load measures. And we integrate Stat Sports through Excel and Power BI to create data visualizations that can be communicated to our athletes and our coaches. Again, during training, we have live data through an iPad. I know Stat Sports have moved now to Sonra, and this is a little bit outdated, but you get the idea. You can split your drills live and you can report live then and there to the coaches and to the players in terms of our typical running demand, for example, is 117 meters per minute. And if we're above or below 117 minutes, I'll keep my communication with my coaches really simple. Go, we're above match play demands for total distance meters per minute, for high speed running meters per minute, and we're below for accelerations, for example. Post training, then, this is an example of a drill builder through Power BI that we have. So again, we can understand our game speed or our game demands for every drill that's cut in GPS. And this will go not only to the management, but also to the players. So in terms of our average outputs per drill, our typical percentage game demands in terms of meters per minute. Additionally, this is a drill database, so I can split any drill over the past 5 years and feed that back to our management. What it allows us to do nicely as well is our training session typically goes out at 12 o'clock during the day, and I can program that in Power BI and send on a predicted loading to our coaches prior to training happening. And our planning being agile in nature, they can manipulate or modify drills based on what our percentage of game demands are typically going to be like. Again, picking 3 metrics that I know have nice standard validity, good reliability, and good sensitivity to change. This is our player report. I've obviously removed player names for anonymity, But again, we have a leaderboard for total distance. We have a leaderboard for conditioning distance, which is meters over 4.4 meters per second, of accelerations, decelerations, and then a high-speed running leaderboard, meters over 5.5, and then I have a max speed and percentage max speed leaderboard. Again, these will go back in 3 separate snips or 3 separate screen grabs into a WhatsApp group where the players are, and the players then will ask me questions outside of that. We also hang these where we train as players walk into the training base, because then we know they have an interest in the data. When we look at pre-training then, so again, we'll look at counter movement jumps with our athletes. We'll do a mean of 3, but again, we're looking at standard deviation change away from a typical performance counter movement jump. So for example, if they're below the yellow line, we have an intervention in place for our counter movement jumps, and then they retest. If they're still below the yellow line, we will let them train. If they're below the red line, we will modify them, again, considering context. And if they're above the yellow line, we know that they're moving well, and we won't modify them. Again, with the red, being below the red, we'll only modify our players based on very specific contextual factors. So, for example, if they report with a poor counter movement jump, their percentage change in loading has been increased on a 7-day average, their wellness is down, and the management agrees to modify them, then we will modify them. We're lucky to have athlete monitoring. So again, we have a nice app that presents our wellness data, our fatigue, our soreness, our sleep quality, and how many hours you sleep. And again, we'll look at this data in conjunction with our GPS data in order to see how our athletes are moving. This is a typical individual player dashboard for our weekly loads and how they fluctuate. And what you'll see is we typically have a 3-week kind of build, a deload, a 3-week build, and a deload as best as we can. Again, we're looking at total distance, high speed running, acute chronics there. We're looking at maximal speed and high metabolic load. This is our volume-based leaderboard. We also have a mechanical-based leaderboard where we're looking at that training density. We're looking at mechanical loading in terms of efforts, accels, decels, accel, decel distance, and the amount of sprint efforts we're getting per week. And based on a multitude of dashboards, whether it be wellness, external load, and also our session RP, we will manage our athletes through. One of the things we're really cognizant of is exposing our athletes to above 85% of max speed on a regular basis. We red, yellow, green this across the season, and this is the last 5 weeks of data for us at Dublin currently. So what you can see is there's a real focus towards regular exposure to 85% plus, and we're always trying to get our athletes over 90% plus. And the reason is we've shown within literature that the higher maximal speed you hit throughout a week, the less likely you are to get injured, because your hamstrings are tolerated to those high exposures and high velocity movements. And we know based on Hagee's work that the quicker the speed of movement you have, the more strain is placed on the hamstring muscles. So again, using nice sound research and applying it within our own setting, in addition to our own literature, we've come to the conclusion that regular exposure to maximal velocity is really, really important. When we look at the variance, I talked about looking at percentage change. So this is another dashboard we have where we look at total distance, high speed running, and accelerations, and we look at their current weekly loading versus their rolling 7-day average, or we look at their current week versus their previous 7 days. And what it gives us is it gives us a meters in the tank. So are they overloaded or underloaded, and the percentage change in that on a week-to-week basis. Any athlete that highlights red for any metric, any of the 3 metrics, we automatically link in with them with respect to alterations in their nutritional plan, sleep interventions, and also encourage them to engage in recovery processes for 24, 48 hours and 72 hours after the text that they get. We'll just finish off with some application of conditioning. So again, Martin Boucher and Paul Larson have been really, really important to the field of strength and conditioning. by providing this 12-step model for how you condition your athletes. I'm not going to go into it in any great detail, but conditioning is important because we know having a good aerobic system is important. Typically, conditioning methods for field sports can be broken into 7 key methodologies. You can have tempo running, long intervals, short intervals, repeat sprint training, sprint interval training, small-sided games, and simulated phases of play being 11v11 with condensed distance or condensed time on feet within those 11v11s, working on a specific phase or a specific technical or tactical setup you want to work on. We need to understand that if we don't have a desired physiological objective, then we cannot program our conditioning methods appropriately in order to get a positive physiological response. If we don't get a positive physiological response, we don't get any improvements in aerobic fitness. Therefore, we increase the likelihood of our athletes suffering an injury. And it comes back to this, is that the content we pick is king, but the context is the most important and the key. So we can have the best content in the world in terms of maximum aerobic speed running, small-sided games, but if we don't respect the context in terms of what the athlete needs and communication of those needs to the athletes, we will lose the positive physiological response that we're looking to get. If we don't work around our coach and work around their needs, if we don't respect the player's bandwidth, their previous load, whether they're in a match or a non-match week, and the player importance, we can probably basically have the wrong program in place for our athletes, and that can lead to maladaptation over time. Again, if we look at this from a hierarchy perspective or a specificity perspective, match play is the most specific conditioning you can do, and it builds back from that. So small-sided games and phases of play are probably the second most specific intervention you can run. If you're looking for a very specific physiological target, then you will look at specific conditioning interventions such as tempo running, longer intervals, short intervals, repeated sprint or sprint interval training. And this is an example of what we feed back to our coaches at the start of every season. We look to come up with a sports science intervention at the start of every season or at certain time points during the year to get our coaches thinking about the application of sound sports science and conditioning principles. So we know that based on our full pitch demand, that there's different small, moderate, and large pitch dimensions. But we give this to the coach so that they can understand the physical exposure that they're putting their athletes through in a small-sided game versus a larger pitch-sided game. And then the difference between static skills and match play or simulated phases of play. Additionally, then at the top, we understand whether it's an intensive game or a smaller game or an extensive game and a larger game. And we attach player numbers to that. So again, it creates a process that coaches can follow to take out any of the emotion with regard to planning training. And the reason we do this is to ensure that we're successful or that we make it down the road. So what is success? Success is very hard to determine, but it's probably some form of injury reduction, improving our physical capacities with our players, improving their physiological capability, improvements in team culture and team buy-in into sports science and also into the conditioning that you're doing, improvements in technical and tactical understanding and execution, development of desirable team behaviors. So setting team standards in order to improve physical and physiological performance, and ultimately improving communication throughout the whole team process, whether that be during competition or off pitch between your key stakeholders. And ultimately, how do we do that? You can split your methods into two: programming and monitoring. If you look at programming, always ask your question, do we have the appropriate volume? Do we have the appropriate intensity? Do we have the appropriate density? We need to ensure that our program is integrated, so it has both running, strength, and power-based exercises in there. We need to make sure that we're integrating conditioning with technical and tactical components so that we're working around our coaches. We need to have a plan in place that's agile in nature, that can change, that's undulating, that has building phases and deload phases to ensure that we're overloading and recovering appropriately. And then with monitoring, what does it look like at a team level, but also what does it look like at an individual level, and making alterations to loads based on the response that we're seeing from our athletes. Monitoring internal and external load is really important. Also monitoring a response variable. Understanding the difference between optimal conditioning and overtraining of your athletes. If they play a multitude of games, do they need to condition in training? Is training enough for them? And always have a long-term approach. Aim to peak at specific time points during the year, and understand that your program is always about a repeated dose effect or a repeated training effect. And what does that look like? This is the final slide. It looks like a model that is coach focused, that links conditioning with technical and tactical components. It can be a constraints based approach with your coach. Give them what the minimum and the maximum that you expect them to complete within a training. So for example, on a Tuesday for us, we say the minimum or the typical is 6K, but if we get 8 or 9K and it fits within your coaching requirements, we're happy to see that. Use multiple variables, use internal load, external load, wellness, look at session variation. And we do this to try and find the most appropriate and effective dose. But we need to monitor that response. How are they responding to the training we're doing? How do we do that? Through some pre-training screening, through looking at previous GPS, maybe using a dynamic fatigue marker such as percentage maximal speed, looking at wellness and also looking at the previous load. And we monitor and we plot that through different data visualizations, and we modify or increase or decrease player workload if required. We need to make sure that we're communicating that to our coaches effectively. And the reason we do that is to ensure, like I said at the start, that we have the most successful players based on their talent level, and we maximize performance to ensure that our captain of our team at some point during the year is picking up a trophy or is succeeding and breaking the boundaries of any team that we're with, whether that be finishing in the highest league position possible, whether it be surviving relegation, whether it be winning a cup competition, or whether it be winning a league. Thank you for your time. Thanks for logging on. And again, if anyone has any questions, they can contact me directly through Twitter and DM me if you want, or you can email me at shanemalone at myemail.ittdublin.ie.
Thank you very much, Shane, for a really nice presentation. It seems that we have no question at the moment, but I will ask you one. We'll see if anyone else have a question after that. Regards to this, we know that from your research that you can, by having good, well-developed strength and capabilities, you can reduce risk of injury, and also that if you hit your over 95% of your maximum speed, you also increase. And sometimes when you in soccer, when you have many games in a shorter time, maybe you have to choose. What would you choose in that regards to fatigue and recovery?
My personal opinion on this would be that my personal opinion of soccer players is that their strength capacity is actually quite low. Based on a number of clubs that I've chatted to and a number of clubs I've worked with, their ability to handle their own body weight is quite poor. And it's typically because there's not really a strength training culture within soccer clubs. But we worked on a little project with Sheffield Wednesday's academy, where a new S&C went in, and we slowly started to expose them to appropriate strength training. By appropriate strength training, I mean lifting appropriate loads in either a back squat, a front squat, or a trap bar deadlift. Not this kind of, I suppose, soccer-based strength training that I would see, or this micro dosing. So we slowly exposed them during the preseason period to strength training, and we actually found that they could handle 2 or 3 gym sessions per week in a 2-game week, for example. And even in a 1-game week, they could handle 2 or 3 sessions. But it's about understanding what athletes need to improve their performance. If they're hitting 85% plus in match play, well, then they probably don't need another top up unless they don't hit that again in a 10-day window. And we would look at a rolling 10-day exposure with our athletes, where if they don't hit 85% plus in a 10-day window, well, then we'll top them up, because we know in match play, especially in Gaelic football, and even Martin Boucher has shown it in soccer, that they'll hit 85% at some point. And if we don't prepare them for that, you're taking a risk, in my mind. And that's, again, using that research and practical head, is that I fully understand if you've 3 games a week, it's going to be very, very hard to expose your athletes to maximal velocity. But if they get it in match play, that's a bonus. If they don't get it in 3 consecutive games, then maybe it is worth having some form of a a warm-up / acceleration / maximal velocity exposure block post that warm-up, and even giving them 2 or 3 efforts and give them the opportunity to open up. And you'll find that players will open up when they become comfortable with maximal velocity exposure. It's probably the best way to program it is a short to long approach, because you go through the acceleration phase, you go through the transition phase, and then you get into that maximal velocity phase. So if you program it across a season where you're working on, say, 5 meter accel, 10 meter accel, 15 meter accel, then you get into 20 meter accel, you get into kind of 25, 30 meter transitions, and then you go into your 45 meter sprint, and you program that and you progress that across the season. You'll tick maximal velocity exposure, and you'll tick an appropriate exposure for your athletes anyway. And it's specific adaptations to impose demand. So the more we expose, the more comfortable our athletes become to it.
What would you say in return to play strategy? What are you prioritizing to build the strength back, or exposing them for like gradually to high velocities?
We would have kind of it's a modified version of Matt Tabner's model of that kind of control up to kind of we call it we don't call it chaos. It's a bit silly. We call it just control all the way up to return to play. During the first phase of that sort of heavily controlled phase, we'll obviously look at athletes' pain threshold and can they load in different areas. So probably one of the most common injuries we would have in Gaelic football, we're lucky that we actually don't suffer quite a lot of them, but a common injury is a hamstring injury. So say a hamstring grade 2 happens tomorrow, we will obviously take the athlete off feet. They will still upper body gym. That's a non-negotiable, because we want to keep lean mass through the overall holistic athlete. Once they begin to ease in terms of their pain threshold, we will slowly return them to a form of cycling or off-feet loading. So whether that be through watt bike interventions, maybe longer intervals, because you don't want them to get giddy and start pedaling at high wattages. So we give them probably 5, 6, 7 minute intervals, 7 minutes on, minute recovery, 7 minutes on, minute recovery. Once they progress through that cycling phase, we will then begin to jog them and slowly return them from bodyweight based exercise all the way back to loaded interventions. Once they've suffered an injury, though, they go into a group. So, for example, in our current cohort, we have a groin group, a hamstring group, an ankle group, and a knee group. And there's different interventions for those groups. So, for example, the hamstring group, prior to training, they have different exercises that they will complete, whether they be isometric holds, hamstring sliders, isometric pushes, whether it be different fallouts to activate the hamstring, and then they'll have different warm-ups that they will complete. But it's taken a long time for us to get there. Like originally there was not a lot of buy-in from our athletes, whereas now we're at the stage where through education and through different corridor conversations between ourselves as conditioning staff and sports scientists and the physios, we've now got more player buy-in to these programs. And typically it's only 1 or 2 exercises in the difference. For example, some will isometric hold, some will Nordic fallout, some will do glute ham holds, some will do kind of alteration steps in terms of activating their hamstrings prior to training.
Okay. One last question for me. I saw in one slide this about intensity, and of course you can measure it like meters per minute or play load per minute or whatever, but it's also interesting with these worst case scenarios. And how do you work with that, or do you work with that, and how do you work with that with game demands related to the training drills and so on?
Okay, so we have actually, originally we were really interested in it because it was part of my PhD, being a bit greedy. So what we did is we used our previous GPS with VX, and we did a segmental analysis. So that's where you split the game into 1 minute segments, and basically you get a rolling average of those 1 minute segments. So what that allowed us to do is allowed us to plot the game demands on a 1 through 10 minute rolling average for every player. And what we did then is we did a segmental analysis of training. So we plotted our drills in terms of 4 minute drills against 4 minutes of rolling average match play to see are we above or below. What I can do is I can send you on a snap of what that looks like if you want to send it out to the group.
Yeah.
It's typically a player. There will be a rolling 1 through 10 minute power duration curve, and then the drills are plotted against that. So you'll find like typically your static skills or your skills drills are way below the worst case, but you typically find a nice timing for your small sided games. So for example, for us, we know for simulated phases of play or 15v15 with modified minutes, we know that an 8 minute phase of play will get us above our worst case scenario all the time. Whereas if we do 12 minutes, typically the first 6 are good and the last 6 fall below our worst case. So it's really good for understanding the drills in a bit more detail versus just looking at average demands. But I suppose the caveat of that is that there's obviously a lot of interest in worst case scenario at the minute in terms of Franco's work and Aaron Coote's work in the area. But for me, worst case scenario was never about programming worst case scenarios for a player. It was about understanding, is the training we're doing above what our typical worst case scenario is in match play? And of course, there's loads of contextual variables as well to consider. But we look at meters per minute on a rolling average and compare that in the drills versus our match play for every player. But we moved away from that because we found an association between worst case scenario and actually average outputs. So we found that if we were at 120% of our typical meters per minute for total distance, that we naturally ticked the worst case scenario anyway. So while there was a lot of work at the start, there was a lot of work that became reduced.
Yeah, I found those really interesting, but it's also hard to know the physiological demands of the you know the physical, but you don't know the physiological, and there where you want the adaptation, of course.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we can like again, I come back to it that there's multiple ways to look at things, and we just need to pick. We need to pick what variables we're confident with and we understand, and that we can actually communicate. Because if we're just picking like heart rate reserve, or we're picking percentage heart rate max, or we're picking player load or dynamic stress load, we need to be able to answer questions on them and answer them really quickly, and not have an or an or a I don't know in those conversations, because you only get a certain amount of time with your coach, and you need to be very definitive in what you're saying.
Yeah. Thank you, Shane, once again. There's no more question here. I hope the listeners has understood and that they have something to take home to their practical environment. Jag vill också tacka er lyssnare. Den här videon eller den här inspelningen kommer läggas upp på svenskfotboll.se. Ni kan klicka in till Elitprojektet, så kommer den ligga där som nyheter. Och ni får gärna sprida den vidare. Så jag tackar så mycket. Thanks again, Shane. We will keep in contact, and we'll see if you get any emails for questions after this.
Cheers. Thanks for logging on, and thanks for inviting me, Dan. It was great to talk to everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, and I wish you all a nice evening. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.